Welcome to the Daily Horror Habit Podcast. I'm your host, Jay Krieger, bringing you daily reviews of currently streaming horror movies for your twisted pleasure. Be aware that these reviews may include mild spoilers. And as always, I hope you enjoy. Today's review is of Robert Eggers' directorial debut, The Witch, which is leaving Netflix on September 16th. Set in the 1630s New England, The Witch focuses on a Puritan family banished from their plantation and must set out into the wilds of the New England wilderness. But as they quickly learn, this new world is filled with old world dangers. And joining me to weed through the witchcraft is writer, director, actor, and most notably, my Twitter pal, Rob Harmon. Rob, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me, Jay.
No problem. I appreciate you taking the time to chat with me today.
Yeah. I was looking for like the right chance, and when I saw that you were doing Signs, I felt like I'd missed it because one of my favorites. But you know, we landed on The Witch, which you for some reason haven't done yet, and I was like, you gotta do The Witch if you're doing a horror podcast.
It was a pretty big oversight on my part, but it is one of those things where comfortable enough now, at least doing the podcast, where I feel comfortable fielding people, mostly from Twitter that I know, and it gives me an opportunity to talk about movies that, for whatever reason, I haven't covered yet, but also movies that I've wanted to kind of just revisit. So like this being a perfect example. But I wanted to say, I recently revisited the horror film that you wrote the screenplay for, which is This Is Our Home, which is currently streaming on Amazon Prime. I just wanted to say, like, that remains so memorably disturbing. It's like dug into my brain in a way that is really impressive, considering like it's a pretty small scale of a movie in terms of just the scope, really, but it's so memorable and impactful that I really enjoyed it.
Well, thank you. That's very kind. I'm sorry you put yourself through that twice. That's a lot.
I had to wait at least a month before revisiting it.
That's fair. Yeah. That was a special, fun little experience. If you ever want to review that on your podcast, let me know, and I'm happy to find you a better guest.
But before we get to that, I wanted to kind of just do the little icebreaker that I do with first-time guests, and ask them kind of their earliest memory of a horror film that affected them for better or worse.
Okay, so I thought a lot about this, Jay, because you told me up front, and so I had time to prepare my answer. And it goes back, I think, to going into my parents' bedroom at night while they were watching something on TV, and it was this horrendous sequence of body horror that I should not have been subjected to as a child, from a movie that I would later discover is The Fly.
Oh, God.
2. I don't know if you're familiar with The Fly 2.
Oh, the second one. I haven't seen that one, but I can imagine.
Yeah. The second one has a sequence near the end that's just, like, I think about it now, and it probably, like, today, it's probably a bit campy. It doesn't compare to anything like, you know, Carpenter's The Thing. Mm-hmm. But as a kid, it was just like, it broke me, and I've never been fixed. That and seeing Signs from a young age was just utterly terrifying. I remember seeing Signs and I couldn't sleep because I was convinced aliens were going to invade. And my parents were very logical because they wanted me to go to sleep. And they would continually reassure me, if aliens were going to invade, it wouldn't be because you saw this movie. So the chances of them invading tonight, pretty low. And I was like, okay, yeah, I could.
The same kind of logic if you get on an airplane and you see a famous person on it. Like, this plane can't possibly crash because there's a famous person on it.
Exactly. So yeah, if I really dug in, I would say The Fly 2, or at least the ending. Does that count?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's funny that you mentioned body horror, because my first real scary moment in a movie that stuck with me and messed me up was Poltergeist, the original one. My dad showed me that when I was a kid, when I was probably too young. And I mean, it's a creepy, unsettling movie, but then when you get to the scene where the paranormal investigator looks into the mirror and his face starts melting and he starts ripping chunks of his face off, like that scene, that's like a NC-17 scene that kind of sneaks up on you in that movie, considering I think it's PG or something.
A lot of those older movies have scenes that are just way out of left field, like grade MP, like, you know, when in Jaws, when Quint gets bitten and he's just gushing blood out of his mouth, it's like, oh, this is PG. Okay. Yeah.
That's cool that we both had that formulative, traumatic body horror to kickstart our horror habits. But
Is that cool? Or does that say something's wrong with us?
well, I mean, that's going to be for another podcast, I think.
Right.
But today, I mean, we're here to chat about Robert Eggers' film The Witch, which I needed to revisit, as you mentioned. It was one that I should have reviewed early on and I didn't, but I'm curious to hear what about the film holds up for you the best on a rewatch.
On rewatch, I mean, I've rewatched it more than a good Christian boy should. It is so good. Um, just and especially when you put on the subtitles, because I'm not educated enough to catch. And and then you have actors like Ralph Ineson. He has this deep voice, and he's very. It's not always easy to kind of catch what they're saying, but man, the themes, there's an ambiguity, a surreality that Robert Eggers likes to play with in this kind of dream, not quite dream logic like David Lynchian, but like he you've seen The Lighthouse, right?
Yeah.
I won't get into The Lighthouse, but it similarly he's interested in telling like a folk tale where the reality might not be as clear. And every time I watch it, I do the same thing when I revisit Chris Nolan's The Prestige. I try to rewatch it with like different interpretations in mind. And so we're allowed to talk spoilers, right?
Spoilers and swears are cool. So
Okay. Spoilers and swears. There's a podcast. The Witch, every time I watch it, I try to position it in a different way where the witch is a different character. Because early on, what sticks out to me, pretty early on, Anya Taylor-Joy's character gets accused of being a witch by her little sister or something. And Anya is like, yes, I'm the witch. I took the baby. I do all this. I fly through the woods at night. And it's just to scare her sister. But I remember it was like my third or fourth watching of that movie where I was like, what if she's telling the truth there? What if or maybe she's like, it's clear as horrible stuff happens throughout the film, she's surprised by it. But what if there is some element of truth of it's her that's drawing this? And that's something that's kind of moving past all the, all the thematic stuff, all the, with religious Puritanism or separatism. I can't tell what they are, but they're I guess they're separatists.
Yeah.
Because they're ostracized from their village, and obviously the feminism. I think Eggers doesn't love that people just call it a feminist horror movie,
right?
But I think it's apt.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with that. Yeah.
Yeah. When you're talking about, sorry, I'm rambling.
No, that's perfect.
But anyway, that's what sticks out to me about the film, all those things.
And I mean, for me, this was my first rewatch, and wow. Which again, that's an issue for another time. But I was excited to actually get to rewatch it with subtitles this time, so that I could pick up on all of the sort of little nuances and whatnot in the dialogue.
Oh, it's a different movie.
Yeah, it's a completely different film.
Yeah.
And you pick up not only on the dialogue, but I also loved that ambiguity that you were talking about, and how the first time I watched the movie, maybe I didn't have the proper expectations for it, but I went in based off of the trailer. And so I assumed it was going to be a more conventional witch horror film, which, I mean, that's pretty fair, I think, based off of the trailer. But I think in revisiting it and looking at it more, focusing on the characters and viewing it as a family drama and seeing how all of these different kind of struggles within the family are happening, and whether there's the witching events or not, like the family at its core is falling apart in a lot of different ways. And again, we're not going to get too much into The Lighthouse, but I love Eggers' ambiguity that he presents his films in, because you could watch either of these films and you could take it at face value, like, hey, these are supernatural events that are happening, or these are people that are kind of succumbing to dynamics with other characters that are perfectly normal, but due to a certain situation, they're having a horrific event, whether it's supernatural or not.
Right. And building off that, if I may, Eggers has mentioned there's a part early on where the farmer and his son are out, like just looking at their crops, and they're not doing so well. And he's looking at corn, And the corn, they don't really draw attention to this, but Eggers specifically chose to make the corn have a disease of some kind, like it's diseased corn. I forget what he said, but he
It's
said
like
something to
moldy,
the
right?
effect, yeah, something like that. And he said something to the effect of people who ate that would have experienced
Hmm.
hallucinations. And so he plants breadcrumbs in there for you to go, oh, it's all bad corn. That's all this movie is.
Right.
If you want.
Yeah, and I think that again that is interest that's a great like avenue that you could view the movie through, or lens rather, that you could view the movie through. And especially when you have that dinner sequence, it lingers on them, and they're all sitting around the table and they're not really having a conversation, but they're passing the bread around, and the camera
Mhm.
kind of lingers there and it watches every single one of them take a bite of bread. And
Oh,
so
I didn't even think of
yeah,
that.
and that was something that I just noticed on my first rewatch. So I started to think about it in terms of that, because I had read that theory where it's like, oh, they're all hallucinating from moldy corn or moldy wheat. And
Right.
I think that that is something that is very rare, in that a lot of times, like ambiguity, obviously it's this could have happened or that could have happened, but the lens with
Right.
which and the kind of avenues and explanations for why things are happening, I mean, there's just such depth there that I think that's really what makes this film very impressive to me on for being his directorial debut.
Hmm. Yeah, which is crazy. I mean, I've tried. Look, as a filmmaker, I've constantly looked at his film and go, it's a it's a period piece in Old English with R rating and no, very few jump scares. It's not a mainstream horror movie. How does this guy get funding
Right.
for his directorial debut to be that? And so that he's a filmmaker I'm very much trying to emulate. It's been interesting you mentioned the camera work, because that stuck out to me on this rewatch, just how confident it is, but very, very low key,
Mm-hmm.
in a very, obviously it's very, there aren't a whole lot of fast shots. It's a very pretty static movie. But even stuff like, like when the mom gets out of bed at night and her silver chalice is like in the background out of
Mm-hmm.
focus. And I mean, I would expect them to rack focus, but they don't.
Right.
It's there, but you can clearly see it. And I love stuff like that. Or the way they shoot the actual witches,
Mm-hmm.
which is very dreamlike. I mean, the whole movie is kind of intentionally dreamlike.
I agree. He has a certain like a seasoned mastery to him, where he's not afraid to linger in spaces that or settings that are not, obviously there's no like big action or massive culminating action moment or something like that. It's more he's just lingering in space, and that
Yeah.
lingering for the amount of time that he lingers and just he makes you feel like you're an observer in what's happening. There's an unease in that most people, you don't see that in their first film. You see them being very reliant on kind of more horror traditional staples. We've got jump scares, we've got this big gory moment here, we've got just that kind of like the low key restraint that he has, and how effective he is in conveying space was something that for me, I mean, I really appreciated that, especially on a rewatch. Again, the first time I
Mhm.
watched it, I was expecting more traditional like witch scares. And if anything, on this rewatch, in not focusing on the witch elements or the supernatural elements that they show, I had a greater appreciation for those moments, because they're few and far between throughout the film. But again, they're so evenly paced throughout the movie that you can really
Mm.
appreciate his filmmaking. And then it's almost surprising when you see something creepy, like when we see the witch after
Right.
the witch captures Samuel, and then we see
Yeah.
him out in the cabin, and then she makes this the stew or whatever out of him, the
Oh,
body rub.
oh,
Yeah.
and that's so I counted. That's like less than 10 minutes into the
Mm,
film. Like it feels like a longer movie because it takes its time,
mm,
but I think credits roll, this might be off, but it might even be under 90 minutes. It's over 90 minutes with
mm.
credits. I know that.
Yeah.
But it's a very lean movie. And yeah, I remember I saw an early screening. I don't want to call it a test screening, because I mean it had already been acquired from
Mm,
Sundance or already premiered at Sundance, whichever. And so they're holding, I guess, a screening to decide how to market the thing. And so I saw it maybe half a year before it was out. and I knew nothing about it, and I was just chilled because it really throws you off. When she pastes up a baby,
Yeah.
five, it's very
Hmm.
abrupt because the whole movie has been this very muted color palette with these people wearing, big hats and Puritan clothing. And then it's like, oh, is she, oh, wow, that's happening. Okay. And it almost takes you like a couple seconds to process what you're seeing because it's so jarring. And yeah, I think it's moments like that. What was your first experience seeing the movie? Was it in the theater?
So I saw it in the theater, and I just based it off of like seeing a trailer, but I didn't know
Mhm.
anything about Eggers. I didn't know much about the development of it and whatnot. And I, like at that time,
Right.
I didn't really know A24, obviously,
Yeah,
as well as we all
they
do.
were still like
Yeah,
kind of new, especially to horror. They weren't like the big horror name they are now.
right.
I think the Witch put them on the
Mhm.
map. And then Hereditary, everybody's like, whoa.
Well, it was like they got put on the horror map, and then it redefined a lot of different like expectations for, hey, horror movies. I mean, this is like that's like a mainstream thing where people are like, horror movies aren't scary anymore, and then Hereditary comes and it's just like, no, we're
Yeah.
more than still capable of scaring the fuck out of you.
Yeah. Yeah. Did you hear Jay Baruchel's recent thing? Did you see what happened with
Yeah,
him?
I did.
What are your thoughts on that? Are we allowed to talk about
Yeah,
that or
yeah,
should we
yeah,
keep?
absolutely. So, just for people that don't know, Jay Baruchel, I believe this is not quote for quote, but he basically was promoting his film Random Acts of Violence, and essentially the quote is to the gist of like horror films are kind of played out; they're just kind of splatter gore, and I forget what other word he used, but it's just a bunch of comments basically saying horror hasn't evolved and it's been stagnant in this kind of this
Mhm.
broad generalization that mainstream audiences sometimes feel towards horror. Promoting your film as being the cure for a problem is like that's a whole like other ego kind of thing. Like no
Sure.
one filmmaker has the specific cure that's going to remedy a problem that, for the most part, anybody that watches horror for the last not even decade, it's being redefined constantly, like on a yearly basis. So this idea that you're making a horror film and yet you view horror in and of itself as being like lesser or something to that extent, like besmirching horror in a
Yeah.
lot of ways. I was
It did come across a bit like peering down his
mhm.
nose at the genre. But I mean, I look at here's a hot take. From what I could tell, that quote was from a press kit that was going out to, like, it wasn't something he said in an interview.
Mhm.
And that to me that says like maybe that was how he pitched the film to like
So
financiers.
that yes, so that is, and I mean he came out since because people on horror Twitter or whatever you want to say, like they were very reactionary to that, and people saying like this is bullshit and all these different things. And
Mm.
then it
Right.
came out, and I believe he himself addressed it, and he was like, "Yeah, this is basically a pitch that, or it was promotion to try to get funding or financing the film."
Okay.
Um,
See, I didn't know about that, but that's what it felt
yeah,
like because I'm putting together a pitch packet for a film now, and I'm saying like this is the coolest horror movie ever. There's nothing else like
mhm,
it. Like I'm trying to be the hype man for
right,
my little project because it doesn't exist yet,
right.
and I'm trying to like convince producers to look at it and go, "Oh, wow, he's right." And so that's the energy that came off that statement. So to hear you clarify that he came out and clarified
Yeah,
that makes
yeah,
sense.
and I mean it's very telling too because when if you know anything, like propose to know a great deal about how films get made, but you have to assume that the person that is going to consume that film, Random Acts of Violence, is completely different than the person that is financing it or is going to have some sort of financial stake in it. Like, not that this was the case with Random Acts of Violence, but I think of it as like I have to pitch this studio exec in a suit, and that's all he is just like a big money bag. Like I
Yep.
have to get
Yep.
him excited about it.
Yeah. And this suit has seen 20 other pitches today of low budget horror
Right.
films. And they're all the next game changing. They're all The Witch.
Yeah.
Every after The Witch came out, everybody was like, this is the next The Witch. But by the time The Witch is out, they're looking for the next thing. You're
Exactly.
looking for Hereditary, for Midsommar, for The Lighthouse, but anyway, yeah, back to The
Yeah.
Witch.
So I wanted to comment on baby the baby smashing scene. I guess I don't know. I don't have a better description for it, but that so
uh,
I completely
um,
forgot how the film opened. And
yeah,
so the film opens with them getting banished from the colony. And then it kind of bleeds into life a year later where they're established. They have this home and it looks like they built a shed. And then I think they're building a second house or a barn or something, but they're
yeah,
established. They've been living here for a significant period of time and
mm,
then obviously Samuel goes missing when Thomason is playing peekaboo. And that's a really phenomenal first label it a scare is while she is looking at the baby and doing peekaboo, but we see it from Samuel's perspective. And so
yeah,
on the third peekaboo or whatever, the baby disappears and we kind of hear rustling in the grass and she runs into the woods
yeah.
and we realize, oh, the child has been kidnapped. Originally, the film was supposed to open with that, which I mean,
Really?
yeah, and I thought like, hey, that would be a pretty good beginning. But then I guess Eggers thought, well, I want to establish who these people are in this world in a way that he doesn't
Mm,
spend much time doing that. And like you said, he's very kind of economical with his time in this movie. And for him to have again, as a first time director, him having the foresight, like, hey, why don't I throw in 5 minutes of exposition and then kind of get right into that scare?
mm,
And in establishing that world, I mean, it makes that scene of we seeing the witch smashing up the baby, and you don't even see it first. You hear it, right? You kind of,
yeah.
that's another fantastic use of kind of the natural lighting in a scene. And that's what they did with a lot of this film, in that you hear the baby getting ground up in the mortar and pedestal before
You saying that like I'm just gonna get used to that phrase. Like,
but I mean, that, like you said, to use the word that you used, like that is such a jarring event and horrific event. And it's handled in such
mm,
that's very refined. Like they don't, a lot of it is implied, right? We don't have to
yeah.
see, we don't have to see her dropping a leg or taking a leg out or something like that. You know what I mean? A lot of, you hear it, it's all based on the sound. And then,
You see bits. You see enough.
right.
You see exactly what you need to see to put together the picture in your
Mm-hmm.
mind of what's going on. And even still, yeah, it's interesting. I didn't know that that was going to be the opening, because that would be so different. The fact that he sets it up with a 5 minute, call it a prologue,
Mm-hmm.
um, that lulls you into not a sense of safety, but it's very, very low
Yeah.
key. It's very chill. And then just to smash to that, because it's an abrupt cut, like with it starts with the baby, a very fuzzy shot of the baby just lying there going meh, and she like strokes it
Mm-hmm.
creepily, and then you see a knife and it's like what, and then it cut to all that follows. If they had opened the movie like that, I'm not sure it would have worked as well, because it wouldn't have given us, the audience, the time to be jarred, if that makes
We
sense.
also wouldn't be invested in this not that we're super invested in this baby, but
Yeah.
obviously you don't want any kid, whether you invest in them or not, to
Look
get
at that
mashed up.
baby.
But I mean, even in that 5 minutes, you are able to form like some real empathy for these people. They came over from another country, they've become established within a community, and then they're sent out of that community, and now they're on their own in this wilderness all by
Yeah.
themselves. Clearly, if I don't know how long it takes to build a house, but it's been a month, handful of months, and no one has come to help them. No one's come to check up on them. And so this idea that they're on their own, and in establishing that, it gives more credence that we should be sympathetic towards these people and we should care for these people. And I mean, again, just his ability to show us just enough that we're able to kind of form our own idea of like this horrific thing that's happening. That really speaks to like the folklore aspect of the movie, in that I think it's
Mm.
telling that he describes it as a New England folk tale, in that it's not a traditional horror movie, because it's more about kind of like preying on what people think is happening rather than what
Yeah.
might actually be happening.
Preying on what would have been their actual fears at the time
Yeah, exactly.
is something I know Eggers has expressed a lot of interest in. Like, I don't see Eggers doing a modern rom com anytime soon. He's interested in periods where people's understanding of the world wasn't quite as informed as ours is now. And what if we took that as reality? What if the lighthouse, what if these guys believed what they believed in the lighthouse was real? And same with the witch, what if their fears of, the potential evils and temptations of a young woman coming into her womanhood and what that could lead to? What if that was all real? Yeah, it's interesting that he does that. I'm really excited for his Viking movie. I don't know if you knew anything about it, but
No, I haven't. I just knew it was a Viking movie. Have you heard anything about it?
I think it slipped in one interview or one podcast because I've listened to every podcast Robert Eggers has done. I'm like obsessed with him in an unhealthy way. And I think he mentioned in passing that it is based on the original story that Hamlet is based on. So like the old Norse story that Shakespeare ripped off. So if I had to guess, I'd say it's about a Viking prince getting revenge.
I have breaking bad news from Collider.com. It looks like Bill Skarsgård has dropped out of the movie because
Wait, as of when?
An hour ago.
Oh, this is new news.
Breaking news on Daily Horror Habit. But yeah, it looks like he's dropped out due to a quote unquote scheduling nightmare.
Oh man, that bites.
Yeah.
At least it's not because he got COVID like Batman.
Yeah. After they just didn't they just resume filming too?
They just started resuming, which is so. It's not funny when anybody gets sick, but that's a little funny.
Yeah. Well, it just kind of shows like the values that major studios have. Like you just got to keep trucking, man. Just got to keep trucking.
Well, I'm sure everybody on that set was wearing a mask over their nose and mouth, except the one guy who wasn't allowed.
I was gonna say that Batman cowl is not great for spreading germs.
No, it wouldn't be. It wouldn't be.
I think it's really interesting what you said in that it's all about him capturing people that their horror and their fear really stems from their lack of understanding around the world and how things actually work. So if you don't understand how something is the way it is, then your mind is going to form these, often part of it is going to be these crazy explanations for what's happening. Like, oh, my chickens died. My goat is bleeding blood. Oh, my daughter must be a witch kind of thing. And he does this in The Lighthouse as well, where it's all about preying on people's lack of understanding. And yet he makes that very palpable for us, obviously a modern audience who understand most of the things that they don't. And yet his movies it doesn't come across as silly. Like this idea that my daughter could be a witch. It's like, oh, he presents that in a way that is so authentic to the period that is incredibly disturbing. And it's something that you can actually connect to in a certain way, just because it does prey on that kind of primal element, even though it's a Puritan's nightmare for the period. He's very capable of kind of translating that into a way that we, the modern audience, really, can feel that fear.
Yeah, no, I totally, he lends it weight because it is real to these characters. And it is real in the world he presents. And that's a good point. And something I appreciate about it, because it could easily come across as silly or campy.
Thomason could have glowing eyes in one scene or something like that,
which I mean, even that, like I could take that. It's all about how it's presented. Like in the opening scene, he has a witch like flying on a broomstick, but it's done in a way that's like really art house, like just painfully art house. So much so that I almost didn't realize what I was seeing. Here's a question for you. At the very end, the final scene, we see a bunch of witches dancing around a campfire, just having a good witchly time.
As witches tend to do.
As witches do. Do you think those witches have been involved in the events of the whole movie, or has it just been one witch?
So that's a great question. I think my thought is that all of those witches are other young women that are coming into their womanhood from around New England.
Oh, interesting. So they haven't been witches for long. This is Fight Club, and these are all the new recruits.
Yeah, exactly. As Tyler Durden would say, they're monkeys ready to be shot into space, right?
Yeah.
But yeah, that's how I interpret it, because the first witch that we see is very old until she kind of does the baby rubbing ritual where she becomes very young and hot. Uh,
Interesting. So you thought that was a permanent change?
uh, Not that that was permanent, but just that the reason that she has probably had to do that repeatedly is that it's part of a spell that doesn't last very long.
Right. Right.
But which I mean, we kind of see that when she grabs
When she
Caleb.
grabs, it's like one of two jump scares in the whole
Yeah.
movie.
But yeah, I kind of saw all the other witches as, I mean, unless my memory's failing me, which it probably is, all the other witches were relatively the same age as Thomason, or
From my memory, they're all different
oh, okay,
ages. They're women of just all over the spectrum. That's interesting that you see that as
just this idea that like the woods are home to more than one threat essentially, and
yeah,
that kind of just
sure.
speaks to the folklore folktale nature of it, in that like the woods are filled with these things that we don't understand. Like this is still the new world, and this is an element of the world that this new world that the Puritans are not ready for, and they
Right.
are very that we find that like they're justified in their fears and just how like superstitious they are on all these things, because we get firsthand, depending on your interpretation of things, like one avenue is, hey, it's filled with witches. The other
Hmm.
one is she ate moldy bread and is hallucinating. But
Which is to be fair, a boring explanation. I would much prefer the witches being real,
yeah,
at least for the movie.
yeah. I mean, so we agree on that then, because I was thinking a lot about the different interpretations, and while all of the interpretations work and like he backs it up, and that again speaks to Edgar's ability to like tell a really highly detailed story and setting and atmosphere.
Mhm.
But for me, like it's all about the supernatural elements. And yeah, there might be explanations where you can dismiss them or you can discredit them, but I just think it's a more interesting film, especially with like Black Phillip being the
Yes.
archetype of everything that's happening, and yet he's been hiding in plain sight the whole movie. Like that to me
Yeah.
is far more terrifying than they're hallucinating or it's all hysteria, because it doesn't really matter in the end, right? Like we still feel all
Yeah.
those emotions that the characters do, whether they're just being hysterical or there's some funky shit going on.
Exactly. Exactly. But I want to come back to something you said about, she rubs the baby oil and she becomes, as you said, younger and hot. And the way I interpreted it is she puts on this facade of a young, attractive woman specifically for Caleb,
Mhm.
specifically because the witch appears throughout the film to different people as what they desire.
Mhm.
And it's established Caleb is kind of going through puberty. He's checking out his sister, which like ew. But like it's subtle, but like there are a couple shots of him looking at Thomason's chest.
Mhm.
He's like developing. And when the young witch presents herself, there's very clearly like cleavage,
Right.
which would be very rare in like Puritan America. And so to accentuate that, it's subtle. They don't draw attention to that, but that made me think, oh, has the witch been presenting herself to different people in different ways? And when the witch shows up, maybe it's not the witch, because when they lock all the kids in the goat shed,
Mhm.
I guess maybe it's the devil. It's either the witch or the devil, in my interpretation, that shows up to tempt the mother.
Right.
And and that evil takes the form of, her sons that went missing.
Yeah.
They're dead.
I think it speaks to this idea that the witch or the supernatural threat that is in this area that's decided to prey on this family, the reason that this family is being preyed upon is not only because the opportunity is there, they're the closest settlers to the woods, but also is that you look at the dynamic between them and everybody is essentially crumbling, except Thomason, for instance. But I mean, that's another thing that I'll get into in a minute.
Do you think she is a witch?
So my interpretation of it on a rewatch is that she is not born a witch; she's made into a witch, and that is
Yeah. Yeah.
that your interpretation.
No, no, I think that's basically the journey of the movie at a surface level. As she is, but there. What about the twins? Have you given them any thought? Because the twins are really interesting side characters. Every time I watch it, because they're just kind of off. They're these just little chaotic anomalies off doing their own thing, getting tied up on leashes and stuff. And if you had the subtitles on, every time they sing about Black Phillip,
Mhm.
it's always something kind of alluding to him being the devil. And when they talk about, Black Phillip told us this, Black Phillip told us that, and then at the end, the big reveal that Black Phillip can talk
Mhm.
is probably the devil. It makes me go, oh, were the twins right the entire time?
Yeah.
Were they've been communing with this goat? What does that say about
Mhm.
them?
Yeah, no, I definitely agree with that. I think that's what I mean. Apart from I find the two of them incredibly creepy looking when they're running around and dancing and shouting about the
Black
goat.
Phillip, Black Phillip.
Yeah, especially when we don't have it confirmed yet that Black Phillip is actually the devil, and they're just like singing
Right.
all these goat songs about their goat. Like the family should have probably stepped in and been like, "You're a little too focused on the goats." But
I mean, there's not a whole lot else to do besides check out your sister and sing about it.
it's a real short list, or get yelled at by mom and dad. But
Yeah.
yeah, like I see them as being the ones that are obviously they're the youngest and they're around the sheep all the time or the goat, and they're the ones that
Mm.
are corrupted first, basically. And in corrupting them and making them almost like his devout followers from the beginning of the film, he uses that to destabilize the relationships further. Like the twins are in constant conflict with Thomason and trying to turn the parents against her and then
Mhm.
trying to feign their innocence. But
But what if they're right though? What if they're right that it is Thomason that's, whether intentionally or not, drawing all this? Because I noticed that Thomason is around a lot of the bad events that happen in the film. Like Thomason, when Caleb wants to go into town with the horse and the gun, and Thomason is like, I have to go with you. And then she goes with him, and something goes wrong. And it's not inherently her fault that it goes wrong. And Caleb gets taken by the witch because Thomason gets knocked out, it's implied.
yeah,
But still, her presence just kind of seems to, and obviously she was taking care of the baby when it went kidnapped. So,
I could understand an explanation of it where I don't see her as being a witch with malice or that she is doing these things,
no,
but it's
no,
more kind of like she's emanating whatever kind of witchcraft
right.
energy that is making these events occur and whatnot. And then Black Phillip is
Yeah,
obviously like, hey, she's a ticking time bomb. I'm going to use this to
yeah.
my advantage to like fully get her into the baby smashing camp of witches. Um,
Are you a Harry Potter fan?
yeah, yeah, I enjoy Harry Potter.
So like Harry Potter, before Hagrid told him he was a wizard, there was just weird stuff happening. He would make the glass disappear at a
Great point.
snake exhibit. So that, yeah, I think she didn't have Hagrid. She had Black Phillip. It's the same universe as Harry Potter.
This is the greater art house universe. We're gonna bleed Harry Potter into the Witch. I
Um,
love it. We joked early on about rewatching the film with subtitles, and
mhm.
it is like you said, a completely different movie when you're watching with subtitles. Obviously,
Yeah.
that happens when you tend to pick up on words better and dialogue and whatnot. But I mean, the authenticity of the Shakespearean language that he's used really had a
Mhm.
profound effect on me just in terms of further conveying the world and how authentic it is. It's not just we're
Oh
recreating
yeah.
all of these sets that we had to make from scratch because nothing from that period exists anymore like it. And and just approaching it with the language, I think gave me such a greater appreciation for just how refined Eggers' view of a New England folktale story that he wanted to tell was.
I find Eggers interesting just as an artist because he starts every project with like a mood, a tone, an
Mhm.
image. He's very visual because he used to be an art director or production designer, I think. But his parents like taught Shakespeare and he came up as an actor. And so he also gets, and that shows in how his actors perform that old-timey dialogue. And it just, the dramatic weight really sells the horror because it feels like they're not doing like horror movie acting, they're doing just really good acting.
Mhm.
Like that part when Ralph Ineson is out at night kneeling in the ground and like shoving dirt in his mouth and going, I begged thee,
Yeah.
I begged thee. I'm like, I think about that like once a week, and just too much thinking about that scene, but it's so good. And Eggers is just the perfect mix of influences to like get to that, I think.
Yeah, and I mean, I think it's really telling that he had the foresight to be like, we're gonna do casting only out of the UK because not
That is that
and
that something that they did?
yeah, that was
Okay.
something that they did. And I mean, it really shows. And it's such a, you would think, obviously, it's such a simple thing, but how many times have we ever seen films that have Shakespearean language in it? And you're like, oh, this is that famous actor just doing their best Shakespeare impression. Whereas in the film, it sounds so authentic coming from their mouths and that you're like, I'm really in this world. Like, I don't see her as Anya Taylor Joy. I see her as Thomason.
She wasn't Anya Taylor Joy back then. She was a no name.
Right.
Yeah, I totally see what you're. So does that mean he's only directed one American actor,
Um,
Willem Dafoe?
Yes. I mean, he might be changing that up for his next film, but I think,
Interesting, because Eggers is American.
mhm. Yeah, he's from my neck of the woods. He's from New Hampshire.
That's right. That's right. You're in New England,
Yeah.
right?
I'm just outside of
Okay.
Boston. That's something that, again, I was really able to appreciate even more is just like growing up in New England. You inevitably end up in the woods, and the woods all look
Right.
like that. And just the way that he's able to convey a part of, I mean, the majority of the film was not filmed in New England, it was filmed in Canada. But there's one scene
Right.
that was filmed in Massachusetts, I believe. And even that brief glimpse, it's like, I can relate to that. I can remember a field I drove by or a piece of woods that I was walking through one day as a kid or something like that. And his ability just to tell, again, this story about people's fears that, like hysteria fears that we as a modern audience realize, like, hey, we have an explanation for these things, but still being able to make that very terrifying in a setting, for me at least, that's familiar, elevates this movie above whatever kind of buzzwords people will attribute to it, like, oh, it's art house, it's this, it's that. But it really has a primal fear element to it that you said you've seen this probably how many times now you've seen this?
Maybe a dozen,
Yeah,
2 dozen,
this
too many.
is for sure not my my last revisit. But in not moving too far away from performances and actors, whose performance stood out to you the most? Because it's a great cast, they all are fantastic, but
That's
it's tough.
that's really tough because I mean Kate Dickey and Ralph
Yeah.
Ineson and Anya, they're all just that's really hard. That's really hard because they're all playing very different things. I mean, do you have an
Yeah,
answer?
so mine was probably Anya. And this
Okay.
was not my first choice the first time I watched the movie. I would have said it was Einstein. And that just
Yeah.
because he is so, but you see the weight of all the events that are happening just on his
Yeah.
face. And yet he is
Yeah.
the one that has very few outbursts of people. Obviously, as
Yeah.
shit gets crazier and crazier, those come out more and more. But he eats such a majority of the like brunt of force of the events that are happening for half of the movie, three-fourths of the movie. But
Yeah.
in revisiting this movie and not seeing it through the lens of like, this is going to be a traditional witch movie and focusing more on the character dynamics, like
Hmm.
I just felt a new found profound sadness for her character and just this idea,
Anya.
yeah, for Anya, and that it feels like everyone is against her, and that speaks
Yeah.
to the like hysteria of the movie.
Yeah, I think that speaks to probably the place of women in the
Mhm.
time, and even probably some unconscious commentary on modern views of
Mhm.
women. But I back to Einison, his last scene before he gets wood piled. I I think I'm still not 100% sure what his last line means. Do you remember it?
I don't.
Okay, so Black Phillip gores
Mhm.
him, like stabs him, and he's like wounded. He picks up an axe to do battle with the goat, which I would love to see that movie. The quote before Ineson's character William gets killed is "Corruption, thou art my father," which to me says maybe that I mean, he's the most stoic person. He's the most firmly rooted in his faith. I mean, his faith is what gets them kicked out of the village. It kicks off the film. So there's a lot that's like hanging on that to like hold the family together and stuff like that. To me, to have his last line be "Corruption, thou art my father," it almost feels like I mean, he throws the axe down. So in a way, it's admitting defeat, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I think this is the event, obviously, that makes him kind of lose his faith. Something that he probably never thought would ever happen. But I guess
So you think that's what that line means? He's losing faith?
well, I think it just shows it's him being very regretful, maybe that he's dedicated his life to faith, and yet in the end, he is. I mean, I'm reading into corruption probably a little too literally, but this idea that
No, no, read
I
into
mean,
it.
this idea that his family has been corrupted. Obviously, he thinks his daughter's been corrupted by witches or the devil and whatnot, and I think it just speaks more to this idea that kind of a fanatical way of life and like an undevout or unwavering devotion to, in this case, it's religion, but overall, it just shows how like being so extreme in something will eventually lead to your life falling apart in a certain way. Like, because
Yeah. Too rigid and it'll
yeah,
break.
exactly. Because I mean, them staying, if they'd stayed at the plantation, more than likely would never have happened, probably. Like, again, we talked about how Thomason maybe is emanating this witchcraft energy, but if that energy is not being preyed upon by the other witches in the area or the witch in the area, would these things have happened?
No, she would have gone to
Yeah,
Hogwarts. She
exactly.
would have had a much happier life. That's interesting. There's also the idea, and this might not have any weight, that William is revealing that he is evil, or that he has an evil force, or that he's part of everything that's been going on, and that he has served a role in it, and that his last line is him confessing, like, this is, I don't know. It's a tricky line to try to, for me to try to parse out what it
I
means.
mean, they are all complicit. There was another true believer like them. They are all complicit in essentially in what is happening to them. Because if you think about it, like
Right.
the mother is very jealous towards the daughter in a lot of ways. Like at the end, when she has her breaking point, she tries to kill Thomason. She starts saying Thomason is being lustful towards the other men in the family, and it's like,
Yeah, seducing
yeah,
them.
seducing
Yeah.
them, and that's not what happened at any point in the film.
No.
So that's kind of like her being jealous, and that breaks a mother and daughter's bond essentially. You've got the twins who are very conniving. They're plotting against other people in one interpretation.
Are they though?
Well, in like if you were to believe that they are not only spreading the gospel of Black Phillip, but they are carrying out the words with like a specific intent. And
Right.
that, so again, it
Right.
kind of comes back to the ambiguity. Like I might read into something that another person might be like, well, that has no basis, but then I could say also like, well, in this interpretation that has no basis. It's kind of why I'm so glad you picked this movie, and in further getting a better appreciation for it and talking with you, is that we could have wildly different interpretations, and yet overall the core elements of the film that really work well for both of us, like we're unanimous in that they are successful at what they kind of set out to do.
Absolutely. And that's what's great about art, especially art like this, that you can really pick over. I want to come back to the mother,
Mhm.
if I
Yeah.
may, for a moment, because in her, at near the end of her character arc, her son comes back to her sons, I should say. I guess that's the devil or Black Phillip, because the witch is in the shed with the kids, unless you want to go with there are multiple witches. Um, and he tells her he has a book for her to sign, and that's probably the same book that Black Phillip. I'm just going to say that is Black Phillip, just because there's a book, and when he speaks to the mother, he whispers, which when he speaks to Thomason at the end, he's whispering. It's just kind of it's played similarly.
Yeah.
So, do you think that was a successful attempt to recruit the mom to be a witch? Established by the film. At the end, they have Thomason sign a book.
Mhm.
And that's probably, something satanic or otherworldly, something demonic. To put Thomason's name in it is to basically sign a deal with the devil.
Right.
Let's
Yeah.
just general. And it seems like the mother was offered that same thing
Mhm.
earlier, and we don't see her say no. So do you think the mom's a witch?
So I would agree that if Thomason is, obviously, we see that she has the potential for being a witch, however you want to read into that, I would say yes,
Mhm.
because obviously her mother, like that had to come from somewhere. But,
Yeah.
and I think that,
And after that point, her mom becomes more unhinged. She lets her hair come down, which, as you see throughout the film, the women's hair are they're very like Thomason has her hair up, and it's under that thing, those thing pilgrims
yeah,
wore. And then throughout the film, near the ending, that gets yanked off, and then her hair gets messy, and then her hair gets let down. And then at the end of the film, she's literally just naked. Like there's
Mhm.
nothing, like it is all puritanical life has literally been stripped from her.
Yeah.
And she is it's almost a rebirth. So I'm wondering what that, if that was a successful attempt to convert the mom or to seduce the mom.
Yes, but because of who the mother is, like that jealousy that we talked about, it drives her into attacking Thomason. Because I can't imagine
Yes.
they would want the mother to become a witch, to sign the book, become a witch, join their ranks, and then have them kill a much younger woman that they're trying to do the same thing to. I think
Yeah.
I would.
Well, they could have gotten them
Well,
both. I
that's
mean, they had a whole.
so that's what I was going to say is that it's more likely that they were trying to convert one at a time, but then
Yeah.
the mother's character flaw is her jealousy and how that relationship with Thomason drives her to attack her, to try to kill her. And had that jealousy, like that's an unforeseen character flaw, I would assume that the devil or whoever, Black Phillip, couldn't read into as much, like seeing that she would carrying it all the way to the fact she's going to try to kill her daughter, which for somebody
That's
that's
in.
so religious, so overly religious and like an extremist in a lot of ways, like
Mhm.
that's that would be like the worst sin imaginable. So this, so
Yeah.
I would agree
That's.
that like it was, they wanted the two for mother daughter witch package, and yet they were
they
they were
they wanted for one.
yeah, exactly, and there was a unforeseen character flaw that turned that into just the daughter turning into a witch. But in your bringing up Black Phillip and the conclusion of the film, what did you think about the decision to actually show Black Phillip depicted as a person? Because the scene
Oh,
begins from Black Phillip's perspective, and we just hear him whispering, but then we see
yeah.
Thomason kneel down, and then the book appears, but we don't see him for majority of the scene.
Yeah. And you never see the book. Like it just, yeah, I loved it because it was such a subtle portrayal of the supernatural that, like the quote unquote baby mashing scene, your brain doesn't quite know what to do with it when the hoof turns into a boot.
Right.
And it's like, what it's a brilliant little trick they do in such a little shot. And I love that even when the change happens, you never get a good look.
Right.
But to me, like the other family members have been tempted throughout the film by things that they desire, whether it's, a mother wanting her sons back or her silver chalice or what have you. Thomason at the end is tempted by what appears to be a very attractive, exotic man covered in jewelry, um, with promises of butter and pretty dresses. He promises just the world.
Would
And I
would
think
thou
that
like to live
all,
deliciously, right?
yeah, exactly. And he that right there is where she's like, yeah, sign me up. But I love that choice to portray him as a man because that really takes away the quote unquote ambiguity of the film,
Mm-hmm.
at least for the logic of the story we're telling,
Right.
or Robert is telling,
Mm-hmm.
is that this is real and this is the
Mm-hmm.
devil and this is the form he's going to take to,
Yeah, and I
to
think that
seduce her.
it speaks to again Eggers' overall the restraint that he is able to show in portraying these supernatural events. Where I agree with your point in that yes, it would be a man that's dressed riches and jewels and fancy clothes and
Yeah.
whatnot and all these things because. Like as we learn, Thomason is becoming a woman. Her family starts talking about like we should send her away to be with another family and whatnot. And
Yeah.
this is for a woman that is now she's turning into a woman and she's all alone now. Yeah, that is what a desire of somebody in that particular scenario. Yeah, that is how they would be swayed to sign a book like that. Like there's never an instance where you don't understand why she's doing what she's doing, or it doesn't feel like they're kind of just having him appear as this man as this point of like a plot progression. It is very central to her character. And again, like where
Yeah.
her character is at. Yeah. And again, like just the restraint that he has in, sure, he shows some supernatural moments, and yet he chose to go with a very grounded depiction of just a man. And it wasn't, and like you had said, it's not, we don't see a lot of him. We see a boot, we see a hand, we see him move behind her. But again, it's never like
a hat.
Yeah, and you see the hat, but
Yeah.
it's never this. You see him in all of his demonic prince
Oh yeah.
glory.
I see what you're saying. You're expecting some guy with like horns and a pitchfork and
He takes the
yeah,
smart approach instead of doing something like that, which you would
right.
probably expect from I don't know how many handful of filmmakers, but
I mean, to be fair, he did kind of do that in his next film
that's
without
fair.
going too much into but,
That's
but
fair.
yeah, no, that I could have easily seen them doing that, but that I mean at that point you could argue that this whole film is a process that's being acted upon I see a lot of parallels between this film and Hereditary,
Hmm.
and I'm proud of myself for not talking about Hereditary too much during this. But the thing Ari did with Hereditary is that it's a story about this family going through this thing, and then there's a bigger story of a bigger plot that's being enacted upon this
Hmm.
family that they're just completely unaware of.
Right.
And I see the witches similarly in that what happens to Thomason, you could almost compare to religious or cult brainwashing, where they attack her stability, which is her family, and they take that away piece by piece until the end. Her whole family is dead and gone, and she has no branch to lean on. She has no foundation. It has been taken away. So she is easily susceptible.
Right.
She's vulnerable. And she's looking for that safety, that comfort, that power that comes with society, with family, with, a group, a church, a cult.
Yeah, she's been primed the entire movie for it, and it's like,
Exactly.
and you see a brief glimpse at the very beginning of the film when they're being banished. Right,
Mhm.
the judges or whatnot of the town elders, they say, "Okay, you're banished. You have to leave," and all the family
Mhm.
members turn and leave, and she's the only one that stays for a moment, and it
Yeah.
kind of just shows she is at odds with her family from the beginning of the film, and she doesn't even say anything, and
Interesting. I didn't catch
yeah,
that.
and I think that kind of speaks to this idea that overall she is a quote unquote bad religious, extremely religious person, in that like
Sure.
she has questions, and her first instinct instead of breaking with her family is like, I mean, I like my way of life here. Do I really want to leave? And so I
Sure.
think that uncertainty again is what is preyed upon, and that in combination with the kind of hysteria of the era. And again, you said, or I think we both agreed, and Eggers was a little uncertain of it being described that way, but it kind of does speak to this idea of feminism in a way, where this idea that the hysteria revolving around like witchcraft, and this is, I believe, this film is 60 years prior to Salem witch trials or something, some time frame like that. But
Not gonna correct you
yeah.
on that. I wouldn't know.
But it just shows that even though the Salem witch trials, which is like a big publicized event, hasn't happened yet, women are still
Mhm.
being downtrodden by like majority of men. And it's like as soon as something is presented that is not very clear, don't have an easy answer, like she is a witch. It's never, hey, maybe Caleb's a witch. When things start
Right.
happening, it's always Thomason is the potential for being a witch.
Well, to be fair, Thomason did lose the
This
baby.
is this is
So
this is true. She would not get a babysitting job again after that.
no. Oh man. Yeah, no, that wouldn't look good on the resume.
Was there one or two other scenes that stood out to you particularly well that we kind of glossed over?
Um, her last fight with her mother is one that is just gut wrenching. It is hard to watch and really well done between the music and the sound design. And her mother is just hitting her and strangling her. And Thomason's instinct is just to say, I love you.
Mm.
I love you. I love you, to try to get her mom to stop. And then she grabs the whatever it is, this cutting tool. It looks like it's used to like sheath corner. I'm very ignorant about farm
That's
tools,
okay.
but she
So you didn't know when the Salem witch trials were? I don't know anything about farming tools.
yeah, there we go. And she starts just hitting her mom, and the way it doesn't, like, she hits her mom, and her mom, like, they both pause.
Mhm.
Like it's not an immediate like stab and you die. It's like she hits her and slashes her face, and then her mom starts bleeding from the head, and it's going in Thomason's face, and it's messy and authentic and very, very disturbing. And then yeah, she kills her mom, and there's just I love that scene.
Yeah.
I don't mean to romanticize her killing her mother, but
It is very effective. I mean,
yeah,
that's one of the few scenes of violence in the entire movie, right? Like,
yeah,
and
that's true.
and
That's
his approach to making that violence, like, it's a very clear-cut choice that he's focusing on a moment of violence happen between two family members. So it's personal.
Mhm.
We never get this scene where the witch shows up again and she defends the family from the witch or defends herself from the witch with a knife or something
Right.
like that. It's very purposeful that she has to kill her mother. And that is
Yeah.
essentially like the deal breaker on her ever returning to any sort of normal way of life. It's just like, well, now my whole family's dead. And the significance of that is, like you had said, she has no stability now in her life. She's all on her own. So it kind of speaks to, furthermore, the entire film, she's being primed to be susceptible to signing the book. Like, I don't know about you,
Yes.
if my whole family's dead and I killed my mother and this new family of questionable people are like, hey, come join up with us, I'm going to sign that book.
Yeah, that's why cults thrive. That's why religions thrive. That's why whole Freemasonry, any gathering of people that just has this is our thing. This is why Facebook groups
Mm-hmm.
thrive. Because we're social creatures, and these witches the witch very smartly preys upon that. I like that. I mean, that's terrible. Also, Caleb's death scene
Yes.
really just the way the camera just kind of lingers on it. And I always forget about parts of it when I rewatch it, like the way they do some bloodletting on
Mm-hmm.
him, or the way he pops up an apple, which he had lied about
Yeah.
earlier. And the way I know Eggers like took verbatim words spoken by people who were supposedly being possessed,
Right.
and like just had Caleb say them. And so that adds a level of, well, you could call it pretentious, but I think it's authentic.
No,
I think
it's complemented by his entire approach to the film, right? Like,
yeah, that's
every
true.
single
That's true.
element of it is authentic to the period. So if, like, I wouldn't obviously know if that was real dialogue that he got from somewhere, but it's sold as such. And so
Yeah.
again, I think it comes down to the actors that they got being just as vital to the authenticity of the language itself is their performances. I mean, it just sells it so well. And it's especially disturbing to me. Not only obviously he has to get his mouth pried open with a spoon and he's vomiting up an apple, but
Yeah.
his, like, when he rises up essentially after that, and then he starts giving like a soliloquy expressing his love of Christ. And
Yeah.
then,
While experiencing was clearly like a sexual gratification
right.
about it.
Yeah.
I wonder how you direct a child actor to do that without saying that.
Yeah.
That's always what comes to my mind, is like, how do you get that kind of performance out of a kid without crossing a
You
line?
tell their parents to translate it in an appropriate way.
I guess so, because man, that whole scene. Were there any scenes for you?
So that was the scene that I was going to bring up, just because, I mean, as we are familiar with a lot of like possession and exorcism type scenes, essentially, which
Mhm.
I think in layman's terms, that's how I would describe this. But just to
Yeah.
see kind of like he goes from this like writhing in pain and then the adulation and like ecstasy of professing his love for Christ, just that mood transition and kind of just he becomes more expressive as becomes more enraptured with talking about his love for Christ. Like, it's super
Yeah.
disturbing to me. And then of course he lies down and is dead.
He dies, and we like hold on him. He just slowly dies, and it's like, wow, that is traumatic to watch.
Well, yeah, and
Yeah.
and again, like, that's Eggers occupying a space and putting the viewer in that space. Like, the camera starts far back and then kind of zooms in slowly, but then it's almost like looking down on him. And it's
Mhm.
such a smooth transition, and it's one that I really didn't pay attention to the first time or notice.
Yeah,
But
the camera work doesn't draw attention
yeah,
to itself.
exactly. And I mean, that's a rare quality where I felt like I was the one in the room that was walking in on something I shouldn't be seeing.
Yes, that's a good way to put it. It feels like you were there with them. And I'm very picky with like demon possession movies, because I feel like they should either be super grounded,
Mhm.
like, quote unquote real demon possessions, which you can find footage of, or if you're going to exaggerate, go all the way over the top. Like
one extreme to the other.
yeah, yeah, yeah. The too many demon possession movies these days, I feel like, are in this middle ground. It's probably one of my least favorite genres, which is why I mean, I've written a demon possession film just because I wanted to write something that I would want to see. And the way they play it, just it feels real. It feels like I saw, oh, who's the director of the Friedkin?
Yep.
Friedkin, there was this Friedkin documentary where he went and like documented an exorcism. Did you see this?
I did not. Oh man.
It was within the past couple of years. It's an interesting documentary, and it's very very disturbing because there's something really just, you look in these people's eyes and there's just something different there.
Right.
And I think Eggers really nailed that with this scene in particular. Yeah.
I mean, that's why the scene works so well for me. And if I wanted to see one of these types of scenes, I want it to be so extremely based in realism, because I mean, it lends itself to the authenticity of the overall film and the approach.
Yeah. That's the language that Eggers is using for this film. So
exactly. And so when possessions are like so over the top, that's when it starts to lose me. So I applaud him for being able to make a, like you said, like kind of like a subgenre of horror that I'm not usually a fan of, and to make it genuinely disturbing without his head spinning around in circles or running down the stairs like a spider.
Climbing on the wall or yeah,
exactly.
I agree.
So in wrapping up, before I let you go, was there any projects, or did you want to plug your Twitter or anything?
Yeah. You can find me at waiter number 3, just the words waiter and the word number and then the number 3. I think that was my first acting role. I'm funny sometimes. I retweet other people's funny stuff.
I will attest you are funny on Twitter.
Oh, thank you. You're pretty good yourself. This has been fun. Hope I didn't talk too much. I love The Witch, and
that's part of what I love about having guests on, man. I get to have people on that they pick the movie, so they're going to be passionate about it. It makes for a much better conversation than if I'm like, hey, let's watch this movie, and then we come to talk about it, and you're like, yeah, that was a real piece of shit. It makes for a short conversation, but I can't thank you enough for taking the time to chat. And for everybody listening, I highly encourage you check out Rob's film that he wrote, This Is Our Home, which is streaming on Amazon Prime. Thanks again, man.
Thank you.
If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to Daily Horror Habit on your preferred streaming service and follow @Daily Horror Habit on Instagram and @Daily Horror Pod on Twitter.